and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sub-Saharan Africans recount Tunisia hell amid crackdown. Racial tensions are spinning out of control as many Sub-Saharan Africans prepare to leave the country. What's at the crux of this issue, and what are the broader implications and signals? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Al Jazeera reports African countries have launched repatriation schemes after Tunisia's President Said launched a crackdown against undocumented Sub-Saharan nationals whom he accused of crimes and plotting to change the country's demographic makeup. The Ivory Coast was preparing to fly nearly 300 citizens out of Tunisia on Saturday. The ambassador in Tunis told AFP as dozens of nationals gathered outside the embassy in Tunis. What's going on here, Dr. Horne? Because the narrative, this narrative sounds an awful like the U.S.-Mexican border issue.
Well, I'm glad you raised the question of the United States with regard to this unfolding tragedy in North Africa. Many of the stories have been documented concerning the persecution of the melanin rich in Tunisia, which borders, as you know, the Mediterranean Sea. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, it's hypocrisy on the part of the United States and its North Atlantic allies, because in some ways, number one, Tunisia is mimicking a prevalent discourse in the United States itself. That is to say, President Said is talking about a so-called great replacement, not unlike the great replacement theory that you hear in certain circles in the United States, where supposedly there is a plot to replace the hardworking Euro-American working class with those who have darker skin from south of the border. Mr. Said is mimicking that. He's suggesting that the Arab and Islamic character of Tunisia is being transformed by an influx of darker skinned folk from south of the Sahara Desert. But the spanner in the works, and in fact, the complicating and tragic factor, is that a significant percentage of Tunisian nationals are actually dark-skinned. And so in some ways, this is a way to get at them, because many of them are now cowering in their homes, afraid to go outside. And the African Union is justified in raising alarm bells. And keep in mind as well that what's happening in Tunisia in some ways is mimicking what's happening next door in Libya. Recall that after the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, there was a certain amount of dislocation engendered in Africa, and it led to an influx of darker-skinned people into Libya. And there have been credible cases of, in fact, slavery taking place, not to mention killings, rapes, assaults, and all the rest. And so to a certain extent, Tunisia is mimicking Libya. And then if you look at the other border in Tunisia, if you look at what's happening in Algeria, Algeria is under tremendous pressure by the North Atlantic countries because Algeria is awash in natural gas resources, given the fact that the North Atlantic countries are seeking to boycott Russian natural gas. That has meant that there is a premium on Algerian natural gas, and that has caused many agents from the North Atlantic countries to worm their way into Algeria and into Algiers, the capital, helping to foment unrest. And so this is a very complicated story, and in many ways, it's an emblem. It's a symbol of a kind of neo-colonialism that has characterized a good deal of Africa ever since the year of independence of 1960. Recall that during the year of independence in 1960, amongst the nations coming to independence were the giant of the continent, speaking of Nigeria. On your program in particular, we talked about the recent Nigerian elections, about their shambolic nature, which makes the elections in the United States seem pristine by comparison, which is saying something given the outrageous mess of elections in the United States of America. And that has led to increased and intensified unrest in Nigeria, meaning refugees steaming into and streaming into Tunisia. And I should also say that there's a North American aspect to the story as well, because just a few days ago, the New York Times did a major story on this question of Tunisia. Obviously, they managed to neglect many of the relevant and salient points that I'm raising here. But the next column over from the story on Tunisia was a story about Africans streaming into New York State and then crossing the border into Canada. Canada is betraying its perhaps unjustified reputation for liberalism by raising hysteria about an influx of merely hundreds of Africans fleeing Nigeria, fleeing Cameroon, etc. So Tunisia is not alone. It's a symbol of a worldwide failure of neoliberalism, a worldwide failure and an Africa-wide failure of neocolonialism. And certainly, I think that our organizations, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus, the NAACP, which oftentimes tells its constituents that it is sworn to uphold the rights of people of African descent wherever they might be, but obviously they're asleep at the switch and need to be excoriated as well.
You know, I got to add this too, and I always think back to this. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, you know, I read Reuters and all of these other, you know, European and American, media outlets that were so horribly offended. Oh my gosh, this is terrible, and this injustice must not stand, this racism. But at the beginning of the conflict, they were like, yay, we got to bring all of these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Christian people over. And they were literally throwing Africans and Afghans and Middle Eastern people, literally in Germany, they threw some of them out of houses and hotels so they could bring in the blonde-haired, blue-eyed people from Ukraine. So even those that are so upset now over this racism, when you look at what they actually did and said at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, they don't have a lot of room to talk, and I'm not justifying it.
Well, obviously, it's a case in terms of the North Atlantic countries of the thief yelling, "Stop thief!" That is to say, to distract attention from its own misdeeds. It is pointing the finger of accusation at other countries. And actually, what they should be saying is that Tunisia has learned all too well the lessons of persecution and discrimination and bigotry. And it is mimicking, in fact, its colonial master. Speaking of France, which has a justified and merited reputation for being quite harsh towards Africans from Senegal, Africans from Mali who come into that country. And in fact, one of the current outrages in France as we speak is the fact that over the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century, France employed many from its African colonies in its misguided, misbegotten wars. Recall that the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which led France to be kicked out of Vietnam, that a significant number of those fighting under the French tricolor flag were actually Senegalese. But the problem is that they were fighting oftentimes in segregated battalions. They had a lesser amount of wages. They don't get pensions today. With regard to their service to Paris. And so I understand the point that you're making, because I, too, recall what happened post-February 2022, when there were these stories about African students being pushed out of Ukraine by the regime, African students being discriminated against when they crossed into Polish territory. And, of course, once again, the African Union had to mobilize in denunciation. But I think that the lesson should be clear to Africa, which is that these North Atlantic countries and their satraps in places like Tunisia are dishonest at best, or unreliable at best, and certainly that bespeaks this new path that many African nations are seeking to blaze by tightening relations with Russia, tightening relations with China, because quite frankly, they don't have that many alternatives.
You know, you mentioning the Senegalese soldiers not getting pensions for fighting for France in Vietnam. That sounds an awful lot like American veterans who haven't been able to get their pensions and get their relief from the VA. RT has a story, Sudan boosting energy ties with Moscow. The Northeast African country is looking to become a regional oil supplier. They're keen to expand cooperation with Russia in production and in talks with the country's major energy companies as they seek to cut reliance on crude imports. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, this should only come as a surprise to those who have not been paying attention. As I've said more than once on these airwaves, Sudan, which at one time was the largest nation by territory on the African continent before the U.S. engineered secession of South Sudan, historically has had a strong communist party with strong ties to the then existent Soviet Union. As in South Africa, those ties have now bled over into a closer relationship with Moscow and with Russia. And given the fact, once more, that the North Atlantic allies are proving to be not only dishonest, but unreliable in terms of their business dealings, we understand why Sudan is trying to tighten relations with Russia. In fact, before this story, there was a story about the Russians increasing their influence in Port Sudan, which is one of the major nodes and one of the major choke points on planet Earth, given its proximity to the Suez Canal. So these are the kinds of stories we should expect to see more of in coming days, weeks, months.
When we see this, you know, it also makes me, I kind of connect that with what I've been reading lately about the U.S. taking more, shall we say, assertive military action in the Horn of Africa.
Well, certainly that is the case. And I should have mentioned when I was talking about Tunisia that there's another U.S. angle. I'm sure you gentlemen recall the failed senatorial race of George Allen, who was running for the U.S. Senate from Virginia. It turns out that his mother, unbeknownst to him apparently, had Tunisian ancestry. And this came out as a result of a scandal when he was accusing darker-skinned people in the Virginia audience of being monkeys. And that led to journalistic investigations and the unraveling and uncovering of his, quote, African, unquote, heritage. One more sign that we need to keep the pressure on, not only with regard to Tunisia, but with regard to their North Atlantic patrons who are ultimately the power behind the throne.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.